This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter, more dangerous. A system that worked so well for so long, we stopped noticing it was there until it stopped working. What you're watching unfold right now is not a negotiation gone wrong. It's not a diplomatic spat. It's the slow collapse of an assumption that held an entire economy together. An assumption about leverage, about dependence, about who needs whom more. And once that assumption breaks, it does not snap back into place. It hardens physically, in steel, in concrete, in contracts that last decades. If you think this is about energy, stay with me. If you think this can be reversed quickly, you need to keep watching, because what's already in motion was designed not to be undone. And what comes next is not a headline, it's a temperature change. And that's where this really begins. What actually controls the system now is not a person, not an office, not even a country. It's infrastructure, pipelines that only flow one way, ports that open toward some markets and close toward others, contracts written to outlast elections. For decades, the system assumed gravity. Energy moved south, always south, because it was cheaper, because it was close, because it felt permanent. That assumption became policy, then habit, then leverage. But leverage only exists as long as there is no alternative. And here's the quiet shift. The system stopped responding to pressure. It started responding to price and reliability and exit options. Tariffs were supposed to force compliance. Instead, they accelerated redesign, not rhetorically, physically. When capital commits to new routes, the system listens. When steel is poured, politics becomes irrelevant. What you're watching is control moving away from negotiation and into geometry. And once geometry changes, everything downstream follows. That's the part most people miss. And it's why the next phase is already locked in. The most dangerous changes don't arrive with alarms. They arrive as updates, as efficiency, as progress. Before, dependence was mutual. One side supplied, the other consumed. Neither could move quickly without hurting themselves. That balance felt stable because it moved slowly. Now compare that to what exists today. Supply that can turn, capital that can reroute, infrastructure designed not for proximity but for optionality. Nothing collapsed overnight. There was no announcement that the old model was over. It just stopped being exclusive. Every new contract signed elsewhere made the old relationship weaker without breaking it outright. Every mile of pipe laid in a new direction reduced the cost of leaving. That's how systems change, not by severing ties, but by making them unnecessary. And the longer that shift goes unnoticed, the more irreversible it becomes. Because when alternatives normalize, dependence becomes a liability. And once a system internalizes that lesson, it does not unlearn it. Which brings us to the moment when the abstraction turned real, when the quiet shift produced its first undeniable shock. The shock didn't come as a speech. It came as a departure, a single vessel, fully loaded, leaving a port that did not exist for this purpose a decade ago. Heading west, not south. For the first time, large-scale volumes moved away from the relationship everyone assumed was permanent. At the same time, something else showed up in the data, quietly, without drama. Flows that had averaged 9 billion cubic feet a day slid down to nearly 5. Not because of an accident, not because of weather, but because the system no longer needed to prioritize that route. That is not a fluctuation, that is withdrawal. And here's the part that matters. Nothing was cut off. No emergency was declared, no retaliation announced. The system simply chose differently. If this feels small, pause here. Because systems don't signal exits loudly. They make alternatives viable first. And once that happens, requests stop sounding like leverage and start sounding like urgency. That distinction is everything. Because the next question isn't why this happened. It's what made it possible to happen so fast. Here's the mechanism that turns pressure into surrender. Markets don't respond to threats. They respond to exits. Once an alternative buyer exists, power migrates. Not politically, structurally. Long-term contracts do the work quietly. They lock in volumes. They lock in pricing logic. They lock in direction. And here's the asymmetry. One side gains optionality. The other absorbs volatility. When supply can move elsewhere, risk shifts downstream, onto households, onto manufacturers, onto utilities that can't renegotiate overnight. The beneficiaries aren't governments, they're projects, assets designed to outlast administrations, backed by buyers who care less about alliances and more about certainty. Meanwhile, the damage doesn't announce itself. It shows up as higher bills, compressed margins, delayed hiring, small cuts that never make headlines. This is how leverage actually disappears. Not with defiance, with redundancy. And once redundancy exists, the system stops asking permission. It just routes around resistance, which is why the next phase doesn't slow down. It accelerates. And it does so without waiting for anyone's approval. Then the pace changes. Prices move first, quietly, then faster. Production doesn't keep up. Demand doesn't wait. Systems that assume slack discover there isn't any. Facilities compete for the same molecules. Homes, factories, export terminals, all pulling at once. No speeches explain this. No policy fixes it quickly. Because the supply isn't missing. It's just elsewhere. Forecasts shift upward. Volatility becomes normal. What used to be cheap becomes strategic. And here's the destabilizing part. None of this requires a crisis. It works in calm conditions. That's what makes it dangerous. Once prices reset expectations, every decision downstream recalculates. Projects stall, budgets tighten, risk tolerance shrinks, and still nothing breaks. Not yet. The system keeps functioning, just at a higher temperature. And when systems heat up slowly, people adapt, until they can't. That's the edge we're approaching now, because the next phase isn't abstract anymore. It's personal. This is where it reaches you, not as a headline, as a bill. Heat that costs more this winter than it did 2 years ago. Power prices that don't come back down when you expect them to. If you run a small business, this shows up as a line item that eats the margin you used to survive on. Costs you can't pass along, decisions you didn't plan to make. If you work in manufacturing, you feel it before layoffs are announced. Overtime disappears, shifts get shorter, maintenance gets delayed. None of this feels dramatic in isolation. That's the trap. Because when systems externalize risk, they distribute pain thinly across millions of people. Quietly. If you're wondering why this wasn't debated openly, why it feels like it arrived unannounced, that's because it didn't arrive. It was built. And once built, it doesn't ask who's ready. If this matters to you, stay here. Subscribe, because understanding this early is the only leverage left. And what's coming next doesn't stop at borders. This is where it stops being domestic. Because once supply reroutes, everyone downstream recalculates. Buyers who lived through sudden shortages don't wait for reassurance. They lock in certainty. They sign longer. They pay more. They remove flexibility from the system. What began as a bilateral shift becomes a global signal. Reliability is being repriced, not rhetorically, contractually. Other exporters notice. Other importers adapt. Energy stops being a commodity and starts behaving like insurance. And here's the destabilizing part. Every long-term agreement signed elsewhere tightens the system everywhere. Volatility doesn't stay local. It transmits. Markets that assumed abundance start planning for constraint. Governments that assumed allies start planning for independence. None of this requires hostility. It only requires memory. And the memory of disruption travels faster than supply, which is why the next phase isn't about who made the first move. It's about who loses the ability to move at all. And once that happens, the future stops being theoretical. From here, the system has 3 paths, not outcomes. Paths. The first is adjustment. Prices stay higher. Industries adapt slowly. Households absorb more costs than they used to. The system stabilizes, but at a new baseline. Hotter, tighter, less forgiving. The second path is erosion. Competitiveness thins. Margins vanish quietly. Production drifts to places where energy risk is lower. Nothing collapses. But capacity leaks out year by year until strength becomes memory. And then there's rupture. Not dramatic at first, a cold season, a demand spike, a delay somewhere that used to have slack. The system doesn't fail. It snaps into priority mode. Who gets supply? Who pays more? Who waits? None of these paths are chosen explicitly. They emerge from decisions already locked in, from infrastructure already built, from assumptions already broken. And here's the unresolved truth. All three paths can exist at once, in different places, at different speeds, which is why the final question isn't what will happen. It's whether anyone still has time to react. There's a temptation at this point to look for a fix, a deal, a reversal. Something clean that restores the old balance. But systems don't rewind. They remember. They remember where pressure came from. They remember who adapted first. They remember which assumptions failed. What's been set in motion here doesn't announce an ending. It removes one. Because once dependence is redesigned out of a system, leverage doesn't come back through speeches or elections. It only comes back through years of rebuilding trust, redundancy, and cost. And the warning embedded in all of this is not about one country or one leader. It's about what happens when power is exercised without accounting for exit. If you're still watching, it's because you sense this isn't finished. It's because the next chapter won't arrive as breaking news. It will arrive as normal. And that's the most dangerous part. If you want to understand where this goes next, stay with me. Subscribe. Because the future of this system will be decided long before most people realize a decision was ever made. And once they do, it will already be too late to pretend this was temporary.